Darling, it's the Shy Life podcast.
Yes, but it's a positive thing, Paul. The highlight, the Shy Life.
You won't find a cast of characters like this everywhere.
Hello, Paul.
Delicious.
This particular episode of The Shy Life is a little more abstract than usual.
Oh,
Okay, looks like the hairy guy is ready to record. 3, 2, 1.
Go Shy Yeti.
Oh, I hope he hasn't found out my secret. Do you think he has?
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Shy Life podcast with me, Paul the Shy Yeti. How are you doing? I'm doing okay. I've got my Deerstalker and my magnifying glass today, and oh look, I can see we have another guest. We have another guest today. We have Martin Holmes here. Hi, Martin.
Hello. I'm representing my Uncle Sherlock today. Yes. Can I have the hat back?
Darn! I'm gonna have to don my Miss Marple disguise instead.
They're much the same. Actually, the very tweedy Miss Marple, the Margaret Rutherford Miss Marple, I feel, is very much Sherlock Holmes with a Tom Baker wig on. No,
Yeah, I don't think I could cope with the. They're quite. I need more stretchy clothes. I don't think I could get into those. So yes, listeners, you may wonder what on earth we're going on about. Well, it's because Martin and I, we're not talking about music this time, not unless it somehow comes up. But no, we're talking about books, and particularly detective fiction, and not in any sort of comprehensive way. Just we're going to start talking about it and see where we get. Yeah. So if you bear with us, I'll just run the theme music, and when we come back, we'll get talking.
It's time for my old buddy, old pal from across the channel, across the pond, Paul Chandler, the Shy Yeti.
He's not that shy. Oh, the Shy Life podcast. Yeah.
All I wanted was a pie.
And then I hatched out of an egg. Okay, bring the mic over. He's ready to record.
It's the quiet ones you've got to watch, you know.
is it metaphorical? Is it deep? Is it deep?
Boy, he's not all that shy as right. Sheesh.
Blimey, Governor. It's the Shy Life podcast.
If you thought that was bad, just listen to this.
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait for it to begin.
It's the Shy Life podcast.
He's positively glowing.
And we're back. So, Martin, where should we start?
Well, I suppose I should start by apologising because I'm actually the wrong person for this. You should actually be talking to my better half, or indeed her mother, because they are the big crime fiction readers. I tend to sort of pick it up by proxy, or I pick up the occasional copy. You know, I do read crime fiction myself. But I don't read. They're the big Christie fans. They're the big Rebus fans and people like that. So they really know their stuff. I mean, Better Half has been picking up. I don't know if you know the range, but they are. Is it the British Library Classic collection of these are kind of golden age detective fiction short stories, quite often from writers who have almost become forgotten, but whose characters were quite well known back in the 20s and 30s. And this is it the British Library collection, but anyway, they've been reprinting these books from that time, and they are apparently, you know, I mean, well, I've read some of them, but across the board they're actually very good, but they're just because they've been out of print so long, people don't know who these writers are. And I don't know, I feel that's a great thing to do, and I think it's a great thing to do from a literature point of view. You know, you shouldn't really have writers who are just forgotten, who were huge. You know, I mean, even people like Alistair MacLean now are pretty much out of print. You know, Alistair MacLean wrote some huge war stories, obviously in that era. So I think it's. I think yeah. But anyway, yeah. But the experts, unfortunately, are not here today. You've got me instead.
That's fine. Well, obviously, we're going to try and stick towards the booky side of things, because I think talking about detectives that were in books that then became in TV series is something that can be kept from a completely different conversation. So,
which I will already have bagged you to have at some point.
Yes,
I'm such an opportunist, Paul.
Well, I've got a bit of information about what's considered the 4 different types of detective, the 4 different archetypes. So, for instance, you have the amateur detective, who would be like Miss Marple, or on TV, Jessica Fletcher, or someone like Lord Peter Wimsey, from outside the field of criminal investigation, but gifted with knowledge, curiosity, desire for justice, etc. Then we have the private investigator, so that would be Holmes or Marlowe or Spade, Poirot, Magnum on TV, who work professionally in criminal and civic investigations but outside the criminal justice system. Then we have, of course, the police detective, and that could be somebody like Inspector Dalgleish, Kojak, Morse, Columbo, Maigret. They're part of an official investigation body, and they're charged with solving crimes. And then the final example would be the forensic specialist. So Scarpetta, Quincy, Cracker, CIS. A lot of these are, I think of them being more TV, but of course probably they are also from books originally. Sometimes if you're not a I do have my favourites, so I'm sometimes surprised when some of the areas I don't tend to follow also come from books. But the forensics specialist is affiliated with an investigative body, officially tasked with specialised scientific results rather than solving the crime as a whole.
Wow. So that would include people who have a particular specialism, so you get supernatural detectives and stuff like that.
Of course. I mean, I guess he is there are books of... I've forgotten what the name of the series is now. What was the one? Oh, what was the name of that show where the guy is a serial killer but he's a detective?
Yes. Oh, now you've thrown me. Yes, him.
Dexter.
Yes, Dexter.
Somebody like Dexter, who I know there are books of, but I've got them, but I haven't read them. But I mean, he was a specialist in a certain area, but he was also helping to give the police work. So.
Well, it is interesting that, because you've got, so many of the ones you mentioned in passing as examples there were actually, they were in film and television, but were also started off as a literary detectives. And it's amazing, actually. I think sometimes people forget that, well, maybe not with Morse, but Morse wasn't a television creation. Morse was a literary creation, as indeed was Sherlock Holmes, as indeed were so many of them. And I think that is kind of fascinating in its own way, that sometimes the televisual incarnations sort of overtake that, but actually the literary roots of it. I mean, even something like James Bond has got more literary roots that people kind of sort of forget about quite often.
Yeah. I'm not going to go through the whole of this list, but there are a few names of. We'll start with the amateur detectives. There's quite a few here that, and apologies if some of them are TV only, but I know, for instance, people like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. There are books of those, and I'm not sure. I guess those books started before the TV series. But of course, you've got Father Brown. And there are some here I've never heard of, like Encyclopedia Brown. I don't know. Even know. I could click on it, but I don't think we've got time. Jonathan Creek. And now I don't know if Jonathan Creek ever had books. I think that is just TV only. But of course, we've got the famous Five. And I always found it interesting with Enid Blyton that. You can talk to somebody and say, and perhaps all say, "Oh yes, I grew up reading Enid Blyton," and find that you all read different series of her. Because I read
prolific.
I think my mum had the 5 Finder Outers which was an Enid Blyton one, but it was probably the least famous of Famous Five, Secret Seven, and then these other ones. And I never read Secret Seven or Famous Five. I read these other ones that she wrote, and also I read like the Magic Faraway Tree and those ones. And I think it was partly because those are the ones my mum had. So rather than buy new ones, those were the ones that I read. But you talk to other people and they're more familiar with something else she wrote.
Well, the better half always says that the reason she started reading Christie was because there was just a shelf full of them, and she got bored with reading the books that were supposed to be appropriate to her age group. So she started grabbing the Christie books off the shelf, which she was probably too young.
Yeah, but I think I read Agatha Christie because it must have been around the time when they were on the TV a lot as well. Although I think it was more accepted, or my parents wouldn't have been concerned if I was reading Agatha Christie, whereas a few years later I was reading Stephen King. But they might have been less happy if I was reading Stephen King when I was 10.
Yes, fair enough. But although I did have a friend who used to sit her very young children down in front of The Omen quite regularly, so what do I know? So who else have we got on this list? We'll come back to Agatha Christie because she is one of my...
yes,
I know. I've segued you.
We've got Veronica Mars, but she is definitely, I think, TV only. But then Hetty Wainthropp, I think TV only. Lord Peter Wimsey, of course, is another amateur detective. He definitely is book first, rather. But there are so many. I suppose I should say before we go on to any other ones. I do particularly remember there was a lovely little bookshop in Salisbury, which I went to a horrible school for 2 years. I'd been to this lovely primary school, and in our area we still have the 11 plus, and I failed my 11 plus, but my parents wanted me to do the 13 plus. The only way of doing that was to send me to this horrible private school for 2 years, and then I got the opportunity to do the 13 plus, and I did pass it, and I got to the grammar school. But for those 2 years, though, the hours of that private school were longer than a normal school, so I didn't finish school till 5.
Bloody hell!
But my dad wasn't nearly packing up work by 6, so I was able to. Some days my mum would pick me up, and some days I would walk. It wasn't that far, but I was only 11 or 12, so I mean, I don't.
With all that extra time put in, you'd think later on in life they'd given you a year off.
Yeah, I think they should do. But I used to have to walk past this old bookshop, which I guess was probably getting ready to close. I probably had to get my skates on because they're probably closing by 5:30, and it probably was at least a 10-minute walk away. But I used to get in there, and I was buying my Agatha Christie books, but I also bought lots of other writers that I never actually got round to reading, because I think by the time I bought so many over the years that by the time I got round to reading all of the Agatha Christie's, perhaps I'd moved on to Stephen King. But I remember I bought a lot of books by, and I'd never been totally sure how to pronounce her name, but Ngaio Marsh. And I can't even.
Sounds closer than I would have got. So yes,
I really don't know.
I think that is what it is.
I'm trying to. Let me just have a. I think she has a particular. She's a New Zealand crime writer. Because you've got people like Marjorie Allingham and Dorothy L. Sayers. I sort of dabbled in Dorothy L. Sayers. I dabbled in Dorothy L. Sayers mainly because for a brief period my dad got me ringing church bells at the church he went to, and I did it for for only a couple of times, really, because it interested me. But the guy there, who was about 112, delighted in sort of saying, of course, you don't do it properly. You're so light, you'll get... I mean, nobody would say I was so light now, but back then, when I was 12, there was kind of a slight concern that, if I lost control of the bell, I'd be going up through the hole in the...
You might be suddenly looking like a thunderbird.
And I thought, well, also going to that school meant that I didn't have as much free time, because I had to go to school on Saturday mornings as well. I know, and had I been good at sport, I would have had...
Kind of monsters were in this.
Well, I suppose it was a boarding school, although I wasn't a boarder. So I guess they were keen to keep the kids as busy as possible, but, they could have left me out of it. But yeah, I had to do some talk, and I can't remember what it was for now. But I think I read there's a Dorothy L. Sayers book, is it The Nine Tailors? And that was all about bells. So I kind of had to do a little presentation, and I think I pretended I read the whole book, but hadn't. I think some of the Agatha Christie I always found an easy read, considering I was probably reading her at sort of 11, 12, whatever. The books were never more than about 200 pages, maybe slightly more, but they were always kind of quite easy to follow. And so, some of the other writers I found, if their books were more like 500 pages, it was sometimes the process of the detectives talking to the different suspects could seem to take ages, and I'd be like, well, where's the next murder?
Well, no, Christie's structure is exemplary, and indeed the fact that she was telling such complex stories in such a limited page count is actually impressive. I feel very few of her stories unravel if you look at them too closely. They do seem beautifully plotted. I was going to, before we sort of got deeply into this, I was going to mention The Woman in White, the Wilkie Collins sensation novel from around about 1860-ish, which is seen as one of the early examples of detective fiction, with Walter Hartwright using lots of amateur investigative techniques, but also Bleak House, of course, Inspector Bucket, in Dickens, which I just think, again, I don't know if you ever read. I mean, Bleak House is a doorstop of a book, but it is. I find it one of the more accessible Dickens books, really, which is and fascinating. And indeed, again, you get, there is a murder, there is an investigation. So they are. I know we're not going to dwell particularly on those, the roots of detective fiction, but those two particularly sort of stand out as early ones that I have actually read. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I was going to jump back into our other list of private investigators. I see that Tommy and Tuppence Beresford, that two of Agatha Christie's creations, are listed under private investigators. Although I think there's only 4 or 5 books with Tommy and Tuppence, and some of the early ones are set when they're young, and the later 2 are set when they are pensioners. And
plots of which have been hijacked by the Agatha Christie Marple series.
And I always like the later ones when they were, because I guess I just have a fondness for old lady detectives or OAP detectives.
Yes,
but
no, fair enough. I find the Tommy and Tuppence books less accessible, to be fair, than the other. I mean, her better known detectives. I think they are. Although, again, her standalone stories, the ones that don't involve any sort of series, if you like. I mean, I know these days all writers seem to be they have to commit to writing about 5 books about their characters these days, especially in detective fiction. No. But I do think that Tommy and Tuppence are possibly the least successful of the Christie character.
The earlier ones are kind of more spy thrillers, and I guess the ones I like are more. You could easily transplant Miss Marple in there instead, sort of thing.
Well, they do actually. I mean, one thing about Marple, or Miss Marple, and Poirot to a certain extent is that they have actually quite lengthy careers. I mean, they sort of appear in several decades, but also, I believe, right at the beginning of pretty much the first book, Poirot is already in the process of retiring.
Yeah.
So a lot of Poirot is actually a very elderly detective, but they don't play that up for the TV version, and also they shift the decades about a bit to make everything happen in a particular era. But there's a lot more range in the actual, because Christie was writing for 40, 50 years, maybe longer, and so she would obviously be writing contemporary thrillers, if you like, which would then sort of use things like aeroplanes or motor cars or telephones, which would change over the course of her life, and therefore would change in the lives of her.
Do you think we're allowed? Is it too soon to spoiler something about Hercule Poirot? Can we say that he was very?
Can we talk about Curtin?
He's a very naughty boy in the last book.
Well, that is an interesting aspect. I find weirdly, I do find certainly with literary detectives being bumped off, I actually find the last novels are always difficult, because I think to a certain extent with these characters, you like to think they're out there and timeless, and they're sort of out there forever solving crimes. And the one I struggled with was Remorseful Day with Morse. I know, again, we're in the wrong segment for that, but I struggled with the Remorseful Day because I feel suddenly, and I know this is the nature of life and all that, I know people's lives end, but for some reason it makes all the other books more difficult to enjoy, because you've got this full stop coming. And to a certain extent with Poirot, it's the same. You've got this full stop, which kind of, once you know what happens in Curtin, it sort of colours the way you look at the character in the previous book.
Because she must have written, because I think that's one of the ones, because she wrote the last Poirot and Marple a lot earlier, so she must. Interesting to think that she did that,
knew that was
and then went back to writing normal books where there was no doubt over it.
Well, they've got a morality, haven't they? I mean, there's a fundamental morality in the character, which kind of gets slightly coloured when you sort of see it in that context, in that wider context, if you like. Which, of course, human beings, characters, human beings, whatever, are complex creatures, and I might think one thing one day and I might think the opposite the next day. I mean, we're all capable of that. But it's just, in literature, I think the one thing about the literary detective is, usually, at least within the pages of that book, the crime is going to be solved, and it's a closed world. But you know that the through story of the detective, you're going to feel to a certain extent that they are the moral compass, if you like. So when that moral compass gets shifted a bit, I think it becomes more hazy. I know the anti-hero is a big thing nowadays, but I do feel that once you lose that moral compass, it's difficult to look at the previous books and think, but you're going to think the opposite of that when it comes to,
Because I don't think there's anything drastic happens to Miss Marple in that. I don't know if there is anything in the last Miss Marple book that.
Which is the last? Is Nemesis the last one?
I think so, but I know that they've sometimes done them when they did them on TV. They did them out of order, which sometimes confused. Because I don't think Nemesis was the last one on TV, but I feel like it is the last one of hers that was written or was published.
Well, of course, it refers back to characters that are in the previous book as well, so it's a sequel of sorts. But I like Nemesis. I like Nemesis a lot. Actually, it feels like a significant. I mean, the other side of that coin, of course, is if you write the last book when you're at the top of your game, even if you then, as you sort of get on, maybe some of them aren't as good. You've got this absolute corker coming right at the end. Yeah. So it's difficult because stylistically people's writing change, and I mean, it must be strange if you've already written your final book and then you suddenly decide, say 3 books down the line, oh, my character's got to lose a leg, but you don't mention that at all.
Oh, now I've just double checked, and actually no, Nemesis isn't the last one that was published.
No,
it was the last one she wrote
in her life,
but it's not the last one that was published. Nemesis is book 11, and it was published in 1971, and the last one actually released was Sleeping Murder, which I don't really, which I think is the one that. I think that was the one that she wrote and kept aside, but I don't really remember anything particularly happening in that. But I think it does say that book is set in the 1930s. So whether it really whether it doesn't really fit, the cover of the book does say Miss Marple's last case, but I don't know that we're meant to. I suppose I'd need to know a lot more about the timeline of the other books.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting, of course, is you get the short stories, which have been expanded upon in other formats, and the short story does serve certain detective stories quite well. I feel, the form of short stories is actually very impressive. I like the short story form. I've never been able to do it particularly well myself, but the thing I like about it is that it doesn't try and stretch out the story to 300 pages when there is only a 30 or 40 page story. But also there's a lot of things like locked room mysteries, and which actually are a puzzle, and the book is a puzzle, and you've just got to really work out how it was done, the how done it rather than the who done it, if you like. And there's an awful lot of that kind of detective fiction in the short story form, which sometimes is much more effective than another 300 pages where they go off and they have to have 6 curries or 4 different serial killers, or the plots have to get more and more convoluted because they are just trying to keep the word count up. I mean, there is a lot of preposterous detective fiction out there.
For my limited amateur writing stance on short stories, when I was a teenager, I would just dash off short stories. They seem so easy, and I was always writing short stories, and then I didn't do any for years. And when I came back to doing them, I suddenly realised that I was just very lucky that I was able to do them then, and that actually it was much harder, and they kept trying to turn themselves into novellas rather than.
That's right.
Although,
well, if you think about it, Holmes is mostly short stories. I mean, they were written for the Strand, but the most of the canon of Sherlock Holmes is short stories. There are only 4 sort of full length or not novella length or longer Sherlock Holmes books. Was it Study in Scarlet, Valley of Fear, Hound of the Baskervilles, and the other one?
That one.
And its name is escaping me at the moment.
It's shocking that.
Sign of Fall. Sign of Fall. But the thing is that the one that best works as a novel to a certain extent is Hound of the Baskervilles. And even for that, Sherlock Holmes is absent for a large chunk of the plot. But also, the Study in Scarlet and Valley of Fear both basically go off and tell a completely different story for half the book before they come back to the main plot. Because actually what you've done there is you've got a short story that's divided by a long story that's about something that's a lot of background. But actually the detective part of both Study in Scarlet and Valley of Fear are very much the start and end, and this whole sort of background of the Freemasons in the case of one, is actually kind of irrelevant to what's really the main plot. It gives you a bit of insight into the motives of the villains, if you like, and why the crime happened, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't need to be there, if you see what I mean. I'll give you any writers out there who need some advice. The way I got around my sort of short story problem was that I decided to write very, very short
stories, i.e. 100-word stories. And I'm not quite sure how it happened. I think I found some that I'd written years ago, and I thought, one of the two of these are quite good. And I started copying them up to put them in a book I was putting together. And then that started getting me to write some new ones. And about 10 years ago, I wrote a load in a very short period of about 3 months. And they were just coming out 2 or 3 a day. And then after I'd done those, they sort of suddenly stopped. My mind is very confusing. I just follow it, let it guide me. But I just stopped. But then when I went back to writing the short stories, suddenly I could do it again. I think having written the stuff so short, so small, it was then easier to unfold to a sort of medium length.
Yes.
So that's just my little thought. Just my little. This is how it works for me.
It's a very valid one, and the other thing about it is that I think that in many ways means that you kind of process all the ideas you have, and the ones, I think the one way you sit there and go, oh, I'd like to do more of this, I'd like to explore this particular story more, is where, and that's how you learn which one you want to go forward with.
Of course, the truth about
valid,
of course, the truth about the 100-word stories was that they were more scenes, like a troll under a bridge waiting for a little child to go over the top so they could eat it, only to emerge from the bridge to be greeted by a little child who was sort of far more deadly than it was. So you couldn't have done it. They were little scenes. You couldn't have done. Well, I guess you could have done more with it, but it's. Sometimes you have to kind of think with short stories, how far can the story run? How much?
Yes. I'm a terrible one. I don't write anything like as much as I used to, but I do find that I suffer very much from word diarrhea. I can, I find actually restricting storylines much more difficult than I just could. If I like the characters, I could burble on about them for pages. That doesn't necessarily make it good writing. But I've found, interestingly enough, when you say about the 100-word story, I've actually found in recent years getting my thoughts into poetry form actually helps with that process. So that's my version of your process. It actually helps me get the thoughts into a kind of order. I mean, I used to find if I was feeling very down, very low sometimes, I could actually haiku my way out of it. By taking the thought that was preying on my mind and just writing a haiku, and then writing another haiku and writing, and over the course of an evening or a morning, I could actually find that focusing the mind very much helps free the mind. I know that's probably a very strange way of looking at things, but I think I think you've got there's a lot to be said for your 100-word story.
Well, I also, because when I did poetry, I often did humorous poetry, and it usually suited rhyming, and that's the challenge. I used to get quite cross that people would look down on rhyming, because yes, it can be done very badly, but the challenge is to do it well. And I wouldn't, sometimes you hear lyrics in songs and you think you could have worked on that a bit longer. You get away with it perhaps in a song where you're moving on quickly and there's music and. But I used to...
Well, there's also the refrain.
Yeah, I used to work...
So you come back to it and you get thousands of people chanting it back to you when you're successful, which I personally find very tiresome, but I don't particularly like concerts. Yeah. But that's, I can see why it works. Because if it catches in the brain, million-selling single.
But I used to...
But we're not talking about music.
I used to kind of, sort of really... work on the line until it was ready, and didn't just sort of and I also used to do, when I did non-rhyming poetry, sometimes I'd be thinking, I'm not even sure this is poetry, this might just be a very short sort of truncated prose. I was never quite sure what some of my things were, because
language has a rhythm, doesn't it? That's the point. And I think that's the beauty of that. And of course, in the end, the short story has a rhythm, the detective story has a rhythm. I mean, it's interesting that you can analyse and break down the great writers the great detective writers, but the great writers generally, you can actually put a formula into place where this has to happen by page 30, this has to happen by page 60. It's a bit like in something like Midsummer Murders on TV. You know, there has to be a murder before each commercial break and all this kind of thing. But the plot has to sort of be in these 20-minute chunks.
Yeah.
But also in detective fiction, there's a certain amount of, you know, the story unfolds. I mean, we used to, again, I know I shouldn't be talking about television, but when Poirot was doing the hour and 40-minute versions, the long Poirot, and we were watching them on DVD, we would start shouting denouement at the television, because at an hour and 20 minutes they would gather. You know, you'd had all the unfolding bits of plot and everything, but at an hour and 20 minutes, you knew the next 20 minutes was this is going to be the solution of the plot. The fascinating thing for that, though, is how much adaptations for television of the great detectives of literature, how much they bugger about with the plot, and yet sometimes how little you notice that. One of the great Poirot books is Labours of Hercule, or Labours of Hercules, if you prefer. And that really does. I think there are 12 actual labours in each. It's 12 short stories, but they are linked short stories. And I think they only actually, even in the television adaptation, they only touch on 4 of them. And yet still that sort of makes a reasonably coherent plot, which actually probably shows you how strong the original source material is. But it's a great book as a read. And actually, I sometimes find with a lot of detective fiction, detective literature, that actually that's part of the problem, is that the book is so good it's almost impossible to adapt it successfully and make the person who read it first feel satisfied with the result, you know. And that's across the board. That's all sorts of. I mean, I always think, for example, I'm a big fan of Mark Billingham's Tom Thorne series. I've bought them since I first found them in Asda, 20 years ago. And I think Tom Thorne as a detective character, I think the plots have always been, again, convoluted and a bit schlocky at times, but actually very good plots. They keep you guessing and they keep you page turning, But the interesting thing to me is the character in my head actually looks like Ken Stott, who plays Rebus. Now, so in my head, the character of Tom Thorne looks like Rebus. So when I watch Tom Thorne and they cast David Morrissey, that feels wrong. That feels, and it makes it more difficult to actually absorb, the character. But interestingly enough, then if I'd see a Rebus, I'm actually thinking, oh, is this a Tom Thorne? Yeah. But the other thing is that that's a fascinating aspect of literature generally. I mean, isn't Tom Cruise something like 5'6" or 5 foot? He's not the tallest person, and he's not the. Well, I mean, okay, he's obviously done some work in the gym in recent years, but he's not the, shall we say, most large and intimidating person as a presence, if you like. Apart from the fact he's Tom Cruise, therefore he's large and intimidating as a presence in that sense. But he was playing Jack Reacher, and Jack Reacher is supposed to be something like 6'4" and built like a brick privy, as it were. And so people who are fans of the books are going, well, he's just completely wrong casting. Although, if you came to it via the films, you'd probably think, oh, it's Tom Cruise. He looks like Tom Cruise.
Now, you mentioned The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Now, according to my sources on the internet, Wilkie Collins is also, it says here that it considers The Woman in White to be the first great mystery novel, but it also does say another... Or
sensational novel. Sensation novel.
Yeah,
yes.
It does also say that his book, The Moonstone, is the first, the longest and the best of modern English detective novels.
Well, this is another thing, isn't it? Because what gets me about the Victorian novel, not wanting to get too sort of bogged down in this, but what gets me about the Victorian novel is how many of them are doing it for the first time. I mean, you think about A Christmas Carol, which is a novella. It's a short book by Charles Dickens, but it invents so much of that spiritual fiction, the ghost fiction. I mean, this stuff doesn't really feature. I mean, you get Banquo's ghost way back in Shakespeare, so I suppose maybe you could say Shakespeare invented all these things. But actually using all that stuff from A Christmas Carol didn't exist before A Christmas Carol came out. There were things that were in the zeitgeist, but actually a lot of that stuff that we refer to now, that ideas of Christmas, comes from that book. And the interesting thing again is that then Dickens goes and writes a detective novel, and there would have been at that stage magazine, the yellowback fiction, the cheap fiction that was being sold. There would have been all that, and maybe the great writers were just thinking, I need to compete with that, but also, they are doing it for the first time. I mean, you might look at these books now and think, it's a bit cliched, it's got the behind you joke or whatever. But these would be when they're being done for the first time. That doesn't make them cliched. That makes them.
Well, this is the thing. I've got a list here of things that happen in the Moonstone that would become sort of almost cliches of the genre in the 20th century, and so, for instance, I guess these all must appear in the Moonstone. So we've got the English country house robbery. We've got an inside job. We've got red herrings. We've got a celebrated, skilled professional investigator. We've got bungling local constabulary. I can't say that properly. Bungling local constabulary.
Bungle.
Yes, bungle. I got detective inquiries.
Bungle.
We've got detective inquiries. We've got large numbers of false suspects. We've got a least likely suspect. We've got a rudimentary locked room murder, a reconstruction of the crime, and a final twist in the plot. I guess these are supposed to all occur in the Moonstone. I'm afraid I've not read it, but it was Dorothy L. Sayers' I don't know if it was her favourite, but she says that it was probably the very finest detective story ever written. So I guess it was a favourite.
But this is the other side of the coin, because about that time, you've also got the formation of the detective, CID. CID department. That's it. The detective departments in things like Scotland Yard and what have you. And I think generally for a very long time, I mean, because at that stage you've not really even had policemen for a very long. The police force hasn't been around that long in the form that we know it. Law and order in sort of Victorian England is a developing and growing form. It's growing its form, but also a lot of the detectives were not necessarily well respected. I mean, because you get shows like Sergeant Cork, for example, which I know we're quite big fans of. But the detectives from that time were learning the job, but also quite often when people kept getting away with things, or people got to, they didn't really think of. They weren't that impressed until the reputation of Scotland Yard detectives came through, and which is why in a lot of the fiction of the era, the official detectives are always portrayed as being a bit slow, or a bit not the brightest bulbs, or a bit slow on the uptake, or plodders. Whereas the genius of someone like Sherlock Holmes and the rivals of Sherlock Holmes, which of course became a series, they are seen as the clever. You need intuition, you need cleverness, you need insight that the ordinary copper doesn't have. Now, this may not be true in the real world, but when things like the Jack the Ripper murders happen, very much people are starting to say, why can't they catch them? Which again, the press never changes. It's something happens that's beyond anybody's control or anybody's experience, but for some reason there's supposed to be someone who's responsible for resolving this thing. And I think we actually, to a certain extent, culturally, we start to expect that some genius will just come along and sort it out, even though we don't trust experts anymore. Go figure. But so I feel in fiction it became more interesting that the gifted amateur was always running rings around the professionals, whereas, of course, in the real world this was not the case. What's the road? Is it not the Roadhouse Murder? They did a series a few years ago, and and there was an actual real world detective, and then they did a few more episodes. I can't remember the crime series, but that was very much it's the first time when people would actually lose their careers over failing to solve a crime, and it's actually kind of weird that again, people in the real world now are constantly having to they're being compared with the detectives who solve everything in 45 minutes in a TV show, or an hour and a half in a TV show, or the CSIs who solve everything. They get their DNA and whoa, we've got him. And of course, the real world is far more pragmatic, far more difficult, far more complicated. But for some reason, we socially sort of feel that the fictional version of a crime needs to be solved. We feel comforted by crime fiction because we feel that it's controllable and you will get a resolution. Whereas actually, if someone nicks your wallet in the high street, chances are you're not going to see your wallet again. And they're not going to pay a price, or at least if they do, it'll be somewhere down the line for doing something else.
There's a private investigator on this list that I've just noticed who I know is a favourite of yours, Nero Wolfe, a character created by Rex Stout. Now, the funny thing about Nero Wolfe, I do now own a couple of the books, but I'd never heard of Nero Wolfe until you referred to him on one of our podcasts, and you just said something and you dropped it in. And I think maybe you thought I knew who it was.
Nero Wolfe is a great character.
Yeah. I went back and I sort of thought, well, I better find out who this is, and then I found out more. But he's a character who's in quite a number of books as well.
Rex Stout wrote. I think there's 50 plus, and quite often the books themselves are either made up of two stories or three. So they are short stories, sort of collected. So some of them are story collections. There are not many of them are full length novels. But the thing about Nero Wolfe, because this is an American detective who's based in New York, and I don't know if you know the setup at all, but he's an overweight gourmand who is a genius, but who is also an agoraphobic, doesn't like to leave his brownstone, his house, and he is assisted by Archie, who is his who basically is the guy who does the legwork. He does most of the legwork and most of the. If anybody needs to be thumped or beaten up, or do some thumping or do some beating up, it's Archie who does it. But Nero Wolfe does not like to leave his house, so he solves most of his crimes from the comfort of his office, his armchair, and they are actually quite fabulous. They are quite enjoyable books. Again, they ran for such a long time that time catches up, and there have been a couple of very good adaptations. Some what's the name? The guy who played Cannon, William Conrad, who played was a portly actor, and he played a contemporary version of Nero Wolfe back in the 70s. The Timothy Hutton produced Canadian version, which is Maury Chalkin, I think, played Wolfe, is a very enjoyable series, actually, on television again. But again, it's one of those things that there's a lot of quirkiness within the character that might not present itself well on the screen. Once you actually see it, you go, "Oh, that's a bit weird." But they are it's a very fascinating character, and again, there are things like there are recipe books. You can get Rex Stout recipe books. He has I can't remember now, but he seems to think that scrambled eggs should be done for 3 hours or something like that.
When you described him, I know he's a private investigator, but it did make me wonder whether somebody had been reading a Nero Wolfe book when they came up with Ironside, from the point of view that it's
possibly
a sort of thinking of a detective who is able to do the footwork quite as much and needs other.
Well, I think a lot of when all's said and done, TV detectives specifically are, to differentiate themselves from all the other TV detectives, There is certainly in the 70s there was a quirk to each one, so you had Columbo, but there was the scruffy one, you had the, like you say, I think isn't Longstreet, is it Longstreet or Longmire, the blind one?
Not sure.
There's a lot of even in the modern era you get the Bone Collector, Lincoln Rhyme, is it? Who is a paraplegic, and that's not. In some ways, it's to differentiate them from all the rest. But also, there's a fascinating thing to me that because I know you're a big fan of Midsummer. I always want to call it Midsummer. I don't know why. Midsummer Murders, and I feel that in many ways, Barnaby in that again is another series that was sourced from books. They're the original Midsummer books. But Barnaby is about the only one who has a successful marriage. In most detective fiction, they all seem to be. There's so many reformed alcoholics or troubled loners, that actually to have somebody who just has a reasonably happy family life is unusual.
There is another one that I will come to, who is. Well, we'll talk about that later. But I know what you mean. One of the reasons that I probably watched Midsummer Murders was that Barnaby was played by Bergerac, but which takes us to another detective who wasn't in a book. But yeah, I
weirdly Bergerac was kind of because Shoestring didn't want to do any more, and Shoestring again was created for television, but it's almost like they feed on themselves. You need another detective. We are sitting here today when they've just announced that Holby City is going to finish, and I've not necessarily been a particular fan of Holby City, but 23 years on television is not to be sneezed at. And that's kind of interesting because you think, well, what are you going to replace it with? Well, you're going to replace it with some other long-running drama that fits in that slot, and 9 times out of 10 it's a soap or a detective story, so I think we may have another detective on the way. But I think that was the thing. Shoestring filled that gap for 2 years, and then suddenly the actor doesn't want to do it anymore. Same team came up with Bergerac.
I noticed that the detective I was going to mention and will mention in just a little while is not on my Wikipedia list of police detectives, which is quite insulting considering he had a long-running TV series as well as all the books. But anyway, I shall leave it and we'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
But I noticed there's a couple...
cliffhanger.
You're
going to put a commercial break in the middle.
Probably. Get Ick singing again. Can Ick sing detective themes? I don't know.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think there are. But certainly in terms of TV versions, they've all got great themes. But the Miss Marple theme from Margaret Rutherford films are just is sublime. I think it was covered by the Fun Boy 3, and I remember us all dancing around when I was at art school to the theme from Miss Marple.
Also, looking at this list, I noticed there's a couple of detectives that I probably always thought were possibly, I guess you do kind of presume that there are books behind a lot of these people, but I was far more aware of them as TV detectives. But Inspector Frost and Inspector Wallander both came from book series.
Well, is it Henning Mankell?
Mankell, yeah.
I love a bit of Wallander. I have read... no, I think I've only actually read the first Wallander book. It was one of those things when I got my Kindle. I downloaded the first Wallander book and read it and meant to read more, and for some reason never got around. I always find that the thing about having books on Kindle is I actually forget I've got them, because I very rarely boot up the Kindle these days. And I remember I had to actually order one when my mother was in her final illness. Quite often I would have to go and wait in waiting rooms in the hospital, and I started reading a particular series, a book called The Coroner, which I think has also actually since become a series, but I read the first book in the Coroner series, and I actually had to go and I'd read 3/4 of it when, for whatever reason, I didn't get to read the rest of it. I think my mum was either discharged or whatever, or it went the other way. I can't actually remember. I just remember I was reading this at the time. And the interesting thing about that was I went and I'd got that as a download so I could just finish the book, if you see what I mean. Because again, the thing about mystery stories is you like to have the resolution. You like to find out. I think it would have annoyed me more to not know how that story resolved itself. So I was able to get it on the Kindle and download it, and the same day I could finish reading that book. But yes, the Wallander is an interesting character, because obviously there's a whole subgenre, if you like, of Scandinavian fiction generally. This is because you forget sometimes that so many books are written, or historically, so many books are written in England or Britain and America, that we forget actually that there are other writers sitting in other countries who are writing perfectly serviceable crime fiction that we might not be aware of because it's being written in a language that either isn't being exported. I mean, I'm sure there's some brilliant Chinese detective fiction. It's just I've not seen any. Chinese detective, notwithstanding. But so you take somebody, and the interesting thing about Wallander in the books is he's very much an ill man. He is suffering from all sorts of diabetic. I think it's diabetes he suffers from, and there's an awful lot of shall we say his bowel movements feature quite heavily in that, certainly in that first book. Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is because he's a man of sort of my sort of age, I suppose, and has sort of the problems that a man of my sort of age has. But the interesting thing about that is that sometimes the first novel for these detectives, if you like, their age is set, and then suddenly they end up having 30-40 year literary careers, and you think, well, hold on a minute, you were 55 back in 1986. There's a few years on the clock. I know that people gently mock Dixon of Dock Green being way past retirement age, but actually, to a certain extent, a lot of the detectives in detective, we quietly forget about their quirks. I mean, there's a whole thing in the Morse books, isn't there, that Lewis in the books is older than Morse. He's an old and not terribly successful detective sergeant, and I think in the early books, Morse used to drive a Jensen rather than a Jag, and as the television series sort of became more well known, certainly in America, they should we say retrofitted that. Yeah. So Welsh Lewis sort of transformed slowly into Geordie Lewis, who was a younger man. Because that was obviously the image that was in people's head by that stage was John Thor and Kevin Whately, and so that was what when they picked up the book, that's what they expected to see or read. So a couple of the early books did get slightly retrofitted. The car got changed, and I think should we say they glossed over a bit the fact that the age of Lewis. But I think it's interesting that because. Of the fictional detectives, Morse seems to have become one of the more phenomenally successful in the last 30 years. Fascinating to me that when I first saw Morse on television, I didn't know it existed as books.
Yeah, the inspector that I was going to mention that isn't on this list and is a character created by probably my favourite crime writer, is Inspector Wexford, written by Booth Rendell. Weirdly, though, until I never saw any of the TV shows, and until about a month ago, I had never read any Inspector Wexford books. Well, that's not true. I think I'd read one. I'm a big fan of Booth Rendell, but she's written so many books that I've mainly always read her standalone books. And I've also tended to like her psychological thrillers or sort of stories which don't involve inspectors, because as much as we've talked about a lot of detectives, I tend to sometimes find that detectives themselves can slow stories down, or you sort of get a bit fed up of, oh, now they're talking to him, and now they're talking, oh, now they've got to go back to him. And I think that's why I always liked Miss Marple, because she was a lot more subtle about what she didn't. She would creep into a scene and she'd talk.
Mind like a steel trap.
But And also, obviously, with Ruth Rendell, she wrote as Barbara Vine, and wrote, and most of those were psychological thrillers. So those were the ones I really liked. But I always said that one day, because there's about 28 of them or something, one day I said I will go through Wexford in order, and obviously she passed away about 5 years ago, and I thought, well, I better get on with it, really. So far I've read 2 Inspector Wexford books. The first one was written about 1964, and it sort of sets the scene. But the second one that I'm reading at the moment is kind of weird, because Inspector Wexford and his sidekick are in the background, really, and the main character is a vicar who is wanting to reopen a crime. So he is kind of doing some of the spade work, whereas Inspector Wexford is not that keen because it was a crime that he thought he'd solved. So I don't know, as I go through the Wexford books, I may find that she doesn't stick to any one formula, or maybe she will do, because perhaps she decided that this second book wasn't quite what was required.
It's interesting that, actually, because Billingham, in his Thorn books, has also written a couple of books that don't feature Thorn. A couple of just general crime novels, but it tends generally to throw in a scene where Thorn appears, and so I think it's not unusual. Again, to a certain extent, when you think back to Sherlock Holmes, those first novels I was talking about, actually, Sherlock Holmes is very much the background character that comes in and sort of saves the day or solves the crime, but actually, a lot of the the story is something else. So I think it's a recognised sort of subspecies, subgenre, if you like, of the detective novel. I was actually thinking, interestingly enough, because I know you're a big fan of Telly's Father Brown. And what gets me about the TV, certainly the most recent incarnation of TV's Father Brown, is how it only really takes sort of passing notes from the stories, and the original stories are very different, very all set in a very different world, and have a very different. I mean, they're a different era. The sort of cosy village of Father Brown is actually more, I feel, is more stolen from St Mary Mead, or shall we say, it's a riff on St Mary Mead. You've got that sort of small but perfectly formed community. But equally, you've got when you think back to something like Cabot Cove in Murder, She Wrote, which of course we should at least touch on because it has "wrote" in the title. I mean, basically, to all intents and purposes, Cabot Cove is St Mary Mead in America. So I feel that the enclosed small community. I mean, what was it that Miss Marple? Basically, all human life, or all aspects of nature, of the world, can be viewed by looking at one English village, and you can work out how people's minds work by, oh yes, well, there was a butcher who did this, who shortchanged me, therefore you can extrapolate that into a real world thing. And I do think that Miss Marple, as that, doesn't have that interrogative approach, and I think that can actually be, it is innovative. You forget actually how innovative Christie is in terms of playing with the form, so it's not just the detective comes in, asks the questions and solves the crime, and that has its place, and indeed Poirot to a lot of the time works very well in that way, but I think there's a cleverness to the Miss Marple books.
I was looking at our list of the 4 different types. We are coming towards the end of the show, although I want to share something else with you in a second. But our last type was the forensic specialist, and it is notable that I wonder if that's far more of a more recent sort of popular. Because technology.
I'd say Carnacki is a forensic detective to a certain extent. I feel even Sherlock Holmes uses forensics in a way that possibly wasn't necessarily recognised as such. But the whole thing about when did fingerprint evidence first come in? It's late Victorian, isn't it? Crime detecting crime detection was changing in that era. But I think you could argue that the specialist detective certainly has its place, and I feel It's interesting that they've announced this week, or last few weeks, that CSI is returning to CBS next year, next season. They are making new ones because it was, again, a very popular area of television crime detecting in the early part of this century, about 20 years ago now. But that was coming from the fact that all these leaps and bounds have been made in science, in DNA and everything like that. But we've always had, throughout television fiction, throughout written fiction, you have the ones who say don't disturb the crime scene, and that goes all the way back to Sherlock Holmes. You can't have your 15 policemen with their size 9 boots trudging around all over the place. I'm trying to work out which are the boots of the killer. So I feel that the specialist has always been with us, really.
Because Dexter comes up. Temperance Brennan, who is
in Bones.
Bones. Again, I didn't realise that Bones came from books. They're by Kathy Reichs.
Kathy Reichs, yes.
Yeah, and you've got Dr. Kay Scarpetta in the Patricia Cornwell books, who I know the name of that character, but I've never read one of her books. Of course, you've got Quincy on TV, but that's sort of late 70s. So,
but of course, Quincy wasn't a detective.
No,
Quincy was a pathologist. But that's the interesting sort of sideline, is that quite often, for the nature of the story, I feel that sometimes people have to run roughshod over procedure and all this kind of thing. I feel that sometimes the fictional detective is lucky in the sense that they don't have to quite follow the same rules as the real world. And again, that's coming back to what I was saying about how people's expectations of the real world solving their crime is different to how it's actually solved, how it's solved in fiction. Is because their expectations come from the fictional version, and actually the real world is a far more difficult and complex place to investigate crime in, as it were. I don't feel that certainly someone like Quincy would get away with half what he gets away with. It's always lucky that he's great mates with some of the policemen, isn't it? That helps. And also that you've got people who are prepared to smash windows and bend a few rules so that you can sort out the plot.
Now, to finish off with, when I was looking into sort of talking about this, I found a Wikipedia page which has the top 100 crime novels of all time. So I guess not necessarily 100% detectives necessarily, but these are quite old. They must be quite, of all the polls, they must be quite highly regarded because they're quite old. First one's from 1990 and the next one's from only about 10 years later. Actually, maybe only 5 years later. But it's quite interesting that it's been retained on this Wikipedia page, so it must be sort of one of the first times they started doing this sort of thing. Now, I'm going to be just the top 10, but then I might pick through some of the ones which I know that we like, which I've seen on the list. So on this first poll, the number 10 is The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. But then you've got The Ipcress File at number 9 by Len Deighton. That's much more of a spy. I tend to think of that as a spy more. But then number 8, you've got The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. 7, Farewell My Lovely by Raymond Chandler.
Raymond Chandler.
And then 6, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I love Daphne du Maurier. I love Rebecca, but I almost that's not it's not a detective. It's not detective fiction. It's a lot more like the Ruth Rendell's that I like. I think.
Probably unpeels like a detective story, but I don't think it necessarily feels like it is detective fiction. But go on.
Number 5 is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie,
which was only on television yesterday, I believe.
Yeah.
Which we play Spot the Poirot at home. So when we switch to that channel, we have to work out which one it was without looking.
Yeah. Number 4 is Gaudy Night by Dorothy L. Sayers. Number 3, The Spy Who Came Out from the Cold. The Spy Who Came In from the Cold by John le Carré. Number 2 is The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. And Number 1 is The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tay. I know Josephine Tay, but I don't really know.
No, well, again, that could be interesting. I mean, sometimes these polls are... I feel sometimes it's like when people go on about the best movies, they shouldn't really be allowed to use anything in the last 10 years because it's something that's popular today. But I feel that the good ones really stand the test of time. Interesting thing about The Big Sleep, of course, is that apparently even Chandler couldn't work out who killed the chauffeur.
I used to have a headmaster who would call me Raymond, but I don't think it was because he was being funny. I think he was just a bit absent-minded, and he could never quite remember my first name.
My English teacher was called Mr. Watson, and so my very first day in English class in first year of secondary school, he actually fed me the, Amazing Holmes, how do you do it? And I was supposed to reply, elementary, my dear Watson, and then he basically then turned around and went, Mr. Watson to you. That was how we started off my English. It's about, funny enough, it's about the only class from last year that I actually do remember. So.
Just going down this list of this first poll, Josephine Tay has another one at number 11, the franchise affair.
Is the Thin Man in there? Because I do like the Thin Man.
I haven't got to it yet.
I like the Thin Man films, so and there was a TV series based on that as well. But
the Nine Tailors, the Dorothy L. Sayers book I mentioned, is at number 18. We've got some more Agatha Christie's. And then there were none at 19. 39 Steps by John Buchan.
Then there were none is absolutely a steel trap of a book. I feel it feels flawless. I mean, of the Christie, I enjoy Murder on the Orient Express a lot because that takes its idea and runs with it, but does it very well. But yeah, then there were none. Basically, how do you actually get all of your people to be victims? And it's possible that some of the adaptations have smoothed over some of the worst aspects of how that resolves itself. Interestingly enough, sometimes they cheat. The other interesting thing about it is that when you think about Fleming, there are flaws in Fleming's plots that get resolved in some of the early films. Ian Fleming.
Fleming is in this list, but down at number 35 with From Russia with Love.
Yeah.
Yes, deals. And
sorry, is Dealey singing the theme from Russia with Love? From Russia.
You're singing that. I'm quite surprised. There are a couple of Sherlock Holmes books. There's a collected short stories and Hound of the Baskervilles, but they're not as high as I would have expected them to have.
Well, certainly,
been,
not considering the top 10, I would have thought. I mean, I'd certainly thought there'd be more Christie in there. I'd have said. But then again, it depends who does the voting. I mean, it may well be American, because there are quite a lot of American writers in there, so I suspect maybe it's American crime fiction. But
there is a Dark Adapted Eye, which is a Barbara Vine one. She doesn't appear as her Ruth in her Ruth Rendell guise. Patricia Highsmith, Strangers on a Train, number 38. There was another one, Talented Mr. Ripley. That's one of those sort of crime novels where it's much more, you get to sort of see it from the point of view of, I do like the Ripley books.
But don't you think it's also interesting that crime fiction specifically, and I feel in many ways that could well be because Agatha Christie was such a trailblazer, there's no shame in being a female writing crime fiction. It's interesting. I mean, there shouldn't be shame in it, but you know what I'm saying. That there were a lot of writers in science fiction and in other genre who had to adopt a male-sounding name in order to get published or to get readership. But actually, crime fiction does seem to be quite lacking in misogyny. I mean, I know in the end the world is a very misogynistic place, and certainly in certain fandoms, you can, you stick your head up above the parapet as a female, you can get absolutely pounced on, which is just pitiful. But there we go. But but actually, crime fiction, it seems to have been okay for a very long time for women to write as women. Interestingly enough, though, we've got sort of a few male writers writing as women. You've got a few female writers writing. I mean, what's her name? Harry Potter. J.K.
J.K. Rowling, yeah.
Writing her what's he called?
Robert-
Strike.
Yeah, Robert
books.
Galbraith, she calls herself when she writes those.
Yeah. So it's still not 100%, the nom de plume. But I feel that the women didn't have to, as much, certainly in crime fiction, disguise the fact that they were women.
It does make me wonder that whether Ruth Vendel had more books published as Barbara Vine over there, because she has another couple. She has at least one more, but no Ruth Vendel ones. But other names like P.D. James and even Dick Francis appear on this list. Dick Francis is a funny one because it's pretty. I did go through a stage of reading a few Dick Francis novels, and of course there's always this. I think it's since been confirmed that it's the truth, but I think at one point, because I think with Dick Francis's books, it was basically his wife writing them and coming up with the plots. I'm not quite sure how much he had to do with them at all, but certainly his wife. Whatever percentage of time he spent on them, I think his wife was heavily involved.
They wrote them at least in collaboration. We've got Dick Francis is another one of those, a bit like Alistair MacLean, that sort of went out of favour and out of print for quite a long time.
There's one here in the top 93 called Wobble to Death.
What?
Wobble to Death.
Wobble to Death.
Wobble to Death.
I thought you said Womble to Death. I thought you were telling me there was a Wombles novel.
Probably make more sense.
Orinoco Investigates.
He wrote Sergeant Cripp, Peter Lear. Peter Lovesey. Sorry. Oh no, best known as Peter Lear. I have a feeling I've seen that. I feel like there might be a TV version of that. But I did see. On the second list, the names are pretty much similar. It's quite useful because it does actually show where, if this book appeared on the first list and how different. But you have got a Father Brown on there. But I did see Rex Stout, The Doorbell Rang, is number 66 on this second
Golden
list.
Spiders is the first one, but it's again that's one of the full length.
I'll give you the top 10 of the second list, and then we'll have to say goodbye. But it has some similar and some different. Number 10, and then there were none, which on the other list was number 19. Number 9, Rebecca, which was number 6 on the first list. The Big Sleep, which was number 2, and is number 8 on this one. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins is number 7. It was pretty much the same place. It was number 8 in the other one. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which was number 3 on the previous list, is number 6 on this list. Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow, number 48 on the previous list. Number 5. Now, the Daughter of Time by Josephine Tay appears on this list too at number 4. Number 1, of course, on the first list. Then we have Tales of Mystery and Imagination, short stories by Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan,
that was number 23 on the previous list. Number 2 is the Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett, which was number 10 on the first list. And you'll be happy with this, though. It seems like a good place to end as well. The Complete Sherlock Holmes is number 1 on this list. So,
Complete Sherlock Holmes, I bought when I was 17 years old. I bought one of those big. I love an anthology book that has the collected, and I sat there and I read it through. I've got a fondness for the Complete Sherlock Holmes. So yes, it is very much for me. I mean, when I think of detective fiction, I think of Holmes, and that's not just because I'm thinking of myself. It's I like a good Sherlock Holmes. I like all the versions of it. I like the updates. There's a lot to be said, and he is a brilliant character. So should be up there. Quite right too.
I just thought, what a sinister turn. if the TV series Homes Under the Hammer could be if it involved just yourself or Sherlock. But,
oh yes, it's been said. I always say, Homes on the Hammer, I duck.
Yeah. Oh well, Martin, thank you very much for helping me dip into some of.
Been an absolute pleasure. I will now have to go and rummage on my bookshelves. It's funny, every time we do the music ones, I find myself rummaging through the CD shelves. So I did finally find I do have two things. I actually found I have today. I found I have got the CD of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which I thought I'd bought, but I'd misfiled.
Yes.
And I do have on a 60s anthology, which I knew I had somewhere, but I couldn't put my hand on for weeks. I do have the Joe Cocker version of By With Little Help from a Friend, so I was quite pleased. So yes, I will be rummaging along the bookshelves now, having talked about all this. So that's
well, I did the same thing. I looked into Magical Mystery Tour and discovered that the full album version, which is kind of 2 different EPs and lots of different singles and stuff, that did come out in America at the time, but didn't come out in the UK until 1977. I don't think they got the EPs. Possibly they just got the full album with the EP plus all the 8, like All You Need Is Love, etc. on the other side, and yet that wasn't released in their lifetime. Well, their lifetime as a band in the UK. So.
Wow.
Anyway, Martin, we
can cut all that out. I know.
Yes.
That's just an aside. All that stuff about the music, but I did feel certainly that I will be going on the bookshelves. So that's good.
Well, Martin, I hope to speak to you again soon. And
well, I'm going to blag you, and we are going to do exactly the same thing, and you're going to sit there with exactly the same notes, and we are going to do it with television programs. So I'm going to nick you for my own show, and we will do that at some point. So
that's cool.
That'll be something for people to look forward to, or look back on, depending on when this goes out.
On Vision on Sound, is that right, Martin?
I believe so. Yeah, I'm not sure anybody's ever heard of it, but
I'm sure they have. Well,
but yes,
anyway,
it's what I do. Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much. And
our pleasure as always.
And yes, goodbye for now, listeners. Thanks for listening, and we'll be with you again soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.
Now, listen, guys, I don't want to cause trouble. I don't want to... I'm no private investigator, that's for sure. But I do feel that I need to... I need to ask you all whether any of you are responsible. And, you know, as I say, I'm no detective, but I do... You know, I expect you to step forward and admit it if... you know, you're responsible. What are you talking about, Paul? Well, let me see. I've got a list here of things that are either broken or have gone missing in the house.
Oh, golly, Paul.
Oh, gosh. Well, I'll certainly put my hand up if it's something I've done.
Oh, yes, Paul, of course. I expect that, you know, it'll be easily sorted. All right. So I have a list here. Broken toilet seat. Anybody? Anybody know who broke the toilet seat? Yeah, well, it might be me. Okay. Now we're missing some things in the fridge. We're missing some honey. We're missing... well, all of the jams have gone missing. There was some cream that Toby was going to use in a recipe. Sausages and bacon, all gone. Is anyone willing to put their hand up about that? Yeah, Paul, I think it probably was me. It's just a little, you know, a midnight snack. I promise I'll replace all those items. Okay. Dear, oh dear, listeners. You really didn't need to be a detective to work out who was going to be responsible.
Oh, golly.
Oh, dear. Yeti Uncle John.
Oh, no.
Yeah, all right. Sorry, guys, I'm sorry. It was me.
I gotta go now. Bye. Gotta go. Bye.
Goodbye, 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 goodbye.
This show is part of the Pride 48 network. Find more shows over at pride48.com.
Oh dear. What's going on now?
Oh, it's the Shy Life Podcast.
Let's go.
I have a voice. I have a voice.
You have a voice.
You have a voice. We have a voice.
We have a voice.
Unique voices in podcasting.
UnivazPods.net.
So, Cromitty, if you were going to be a detective, what sort of detective, would you be? Would you be a police detective? Would you be a private investigator? Would you be like an amateur detective? A forensic detective? Well, Paul, I think that if I was given a choice, I think I would be an amateur investigator. I always like that sort of thing. It's you get away with a lot more when people don't realise you're a policeman. I completely agree, Cromitty. Yes. So, what would you be? Would you be you, or would you be a character with a particular trait? Oh, good point. I think that I would be an eccentric, antique dealer. Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I guess if you were an eccentric antiques dealer, you could go to, I guess, it's a little bit like Lovejoy. Do you know Lovejoy? I think I do, Paul. He's sort of an amateur detective. Yeah. Well, I guess he's more auctions, but maybe you could. The thing is, the more you think about it, so many, there are so many detectives over the years. People have had to kind of, are there any types of detectives left, especially with the amateur ones? Is there any sort of career trope that hasn't been used? It must become harder and harder the more you think. Oh, yes, I know what you mean, Paul. Dear, oh dear. I don't know. I thought you made a very good detective, working out that yet Uncle John had taken the stuff from the fridge. Well, I don't know about being a detective, Cromitty. I think partly that was obvious, and partly, well, he did admit it. Yeah. Well, maybe you're right. Dear, oh dear, Yeti Uncle John. I know. But, oh well. It also doesn't take a detective to see that it's the end of the episode, so we ought to say goodbye. Oh yes. Goodbye, listeners. Goodbye for now. Bye, listeners.
Oh my God, there's nothing I like better is when another new episode of the Shy Life Podcast comes out. Whoa, I love that one. Great show, Paul. Yep, that was a good shoot. Oh, kitty, kitty, kitty. Purr, kitty, kitty, kitty. Oh, I love Dee.
Should be up there, quite right up there, quite right up there. Should be up there, quite right up there, quite right up there. Should be up there, quite right up there, quite right up there. Should be up there, quite right up there.